On the morning of September 18, 2019, just outside Macon, Bibb County, Georgia, the first thing people noticed wasn't the woman standing beside the soybean field. It was the smell. Fresh molasses. Thick. Sweet. Strange. It clung to the red Georgia clay like syrup poured across a kitchen table. Then someone laughed. By 8:30, half a dozen pickup trucks lined the gravel road bordering Old Houston Road. Farmers on their way to the grain cooperative slowed almost instinctively. Nobody wanted to miss a spectacle, especially one involving the old Carter farm, a place most locals believed had no business surviving another season. Standing beside a weathered fence was Naomi Carter, 39 years old, wearing faded denim overalls, a pale blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly above her wrists, and boots that had been repaired so many times the leather looked stitched together from different decades. Her dark skin glowed beneath the late summer sun. She wasn't dressed like someone trying to impress anybody. She never did. Her hands carried the story instead. Scarred knuckles. Calloused palms. Strong fingers that had rebuilt more broken machinery than most mechanics in Bibb County. She looked at the sticky mess covering nearly 3 acres of soybeans without saying a word. Across the fence stood Richard Lawson, 48, owner of nearly 4,000 acres spread across Bibb and Twiggs counties. New combines. New trucks. New grain bins. Every machine painted so brightly they looked untouched by dirt. Richard leaned comfortably against the polished fender of his brand-new John Deere 8R 370, a tractor producing 370 horsepower, more power than Naomi's entire machinery collection combined. He laughed again. "You should thank me," he called loudly enough for everyone gathered to hear. "At least your field finally looks valuable." More laughter followed. Someone slapped the hood of a pickup. Someone else pulled out a phone. Naomi slowly walked toward the fence. Her pace never changed. She looked directly at Richard. "If you're finished," she said softly, "I've got work to do." That answer somehow made him laugh even harder. "Work?" Richard grinned. "With what?" "That museum piece." He pointed toward the faded red tractor parked beside Naomi's equipment shed. A 1951 Farmall M. 44 drawbar horsepower. Nearly 6,000 pounds. Bought new in February 1951 from a dealership in Macon, Georgia, for $2,174, according to the original receipt still folded inside a rusted tobacco tin. Most people saw rust. Naomi saw family. Let me tell you about that Farmall M. Her grandfather, Isaiah Carter, purchased it after returning from military service during the Korean War era. For almost 70 years it planted corn, cultivated cotton, pulled hay wagons, powered belt-driven equipment, and hauled timber after hurricanes swept through central Georgia. Every winter, Isaiah changed every fluid himself. Every spring, he adjusted every valve by hand. When Naomi inherited the tractor, she refused every offer to sell it. Collectors offered $15,000. Restoration enthusiasts offered $20,000. She declined every one. Because some machines aren't measured in dollars. They're measured in memories. Richard didn't understand that. Neither did most of the crowd. To them, old equipment meant failure. To Naomi, it meant continuity. One of the younger farmers stepped closer. "You still using that thing every day?" Naomi nodded. "It still starts." The man chuckled. "My phone has more technology." Naomi smiled politely. "So does my microwave." Even Richard laughed at that. But she wasn't joking. She simply continued walking toward the tractor. The laughter slowly faded as she climbed into the worn metal seat. She turned the fuel valve, pulled the choke halfway, checked the gear shift, pressed the starter. For 2 long seconds. Nothing. Richard folded his arms. "I knew it." Then came a deep metallic cough. Another. A slow roll of gray exhaust drifted into the September air. The old 4-cylinder engine settled into its unmistakable rhythm. Steady. Patient. Alive. Naomi rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel. The tractor idled as smoothly as it had decades earlier. No dramatic revving. No smoke show. Just quiet confidence. Exactly like its owner. Richard shook his head. "You know what your problem is?" Naomi looked over. You think old things deserve respect just because they're old? She answered without hesitation. No. She looked toward the soybean rows. I think things deserve respect when they've earned it. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The sentence hung over the field heavier than the smell of molasses. Have you ever owned something everyone else dismissed as junk, yet you knew its value because of the memories attached to it? Sometimes the world measures worth by appearance. The people who build lasting things rarely do. Richard climbed into his pickup. Before closing the door, he leaned out one last time. One day somebody with real money is going to buy this place. Naomi nodded. I hope they love it. That answer irritated him more than an argument would have. He drove away, spraying gravel behind him. The crowd slowly dispersed. Within minutes the road was empty again. Naomi spent the rest of the afternoon washing sticky molasses from soybean leaves with portable irrigation lines. Most farmers would have called it pointless. She didn't. Every plant deserved the chance to recover. That evening, as the Georgia sun settled behind the pine trees, Naomi walked through the old equipment shed. There sat a 1963 New Holland Super Hayliner 68 baler, a 1958 Dearborn two-bottom plow, steel seed hoppers polished from decades of careful hands. Nothing inside was abandoned. Everything had a place. Everything still worked. Her father used to say, "Take care of your tools long enough, and they'll introduce your grandchildren to your fingerprints." She believed him. Let me tell you about Naomi Carter. People around Bibb County assumed she stayed because she couldn't afford to leave. The truth was exactly the opposite. She had graduated near the top of her class from the University of Georgia with a degree in agricultural economics. She had spent 12 years quietly building something no one in Macon knew existed. She never discussed business at church, never mentioned meetings, never bragged about investments. Every Monday she drove 2 hours to Atlanta wearing business clothes instead of overalls. Every Tuesday morning she was back repairing fences before sunrise. The townspeople believed she worked odd consulting jobs. That assumption suited her perfectly, because silence has a remarkable way of hiding success. Late that night, while Richard Lawson celebrated another land purchase with several local investors at a steakhouse in downtown Macon, Naomi unlocked a weathered filing cabinet inside the farmhouse. She removed a single blue folder. Across the top were the words, Carter Agricultural Holdings. Inside lay purchase agreements, bank authorizations, corporate maps, dozens of properties highlighted across central Georgia. More than anyone in Bibb County could have imagined. Naomi studied the newest acquisition map for only a moment before answering a phone that had begun to ring. The voice on the other end spoke only 7 quiet words. They accepted your final offer this afternoon. Naomi closed the folder, looked toward the lights glowing across Richard Lawson's sprawling farm, and smiled for the first time all day. Because by sunrise, everything he believed he owned would belong to someone he had laughed at in front of the entire county. The next morning, September 19, 2019, began before sunrise. A cool mist drifted across the soybean rows of Carter Farm, settling over the red clay of Bibb County, Georgia. Dew clung to every leaf that had survived the previous day's humiliation. The smell of molasses still lingered faintly in the air, but Naomi Carter didn't seem to notice anymore. She was already working. The old 1951 Farmall M rumbled steadily across the edge of the field, pulling a restored boom sprayer that had once belonged to her father. The engine never hurried. Neither did Naomi. Across the county, Richard Lawson was having breakfast with his accountant. Stacks of paperwork covered the table inside the office overlooking his grain storage bins. "I'll own every workable acre between Macon and Dry Branch before Christmas," Richard said confidently. His accountant adjusted his glasses. "Almost every acre." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "The Carter place." Richard laughed. "That old farm. She'll sell eventually." The accountant quietly slid a folder across the desk. "I've tried." Richard's smile faded. "What do you mean you've tried?" 3 offers. "I never heard about 3 offers." "Because she declined every one before negotiations even started." Richard leaned back. "For how much?" The last offer was $1.8 million. Richard blinked. For 87 acres. She never countered. Silence filled the office. Richard had spent most of his career believing everyone had a price. Naomi Carter was beginning to challenge that belief. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, a black SUV turned onto the gravel road leading toward Carter Farm. It wasn't from a bank. It wasn't from a dealership. The driver stepped out wearing work boots instead of polished shoes. His name was Daniel Brooks, Regional Director of Heartland Agricultural Holdings, a privately owned farm investment company that specialized in preserving family farms instead of replacing them. He removed his cap as Naomi walked over. "Morning, Ms. Carter." "Morning, Daniel. You've seen the papers?" She nodded. "They signed yesterday." Daniel smiled. "Congratulations." Naomi didn't. Instead, she looked across the fence toward Richard's fields. "Congratulations can wait." Daniel understood exactly what she meant. "Let me tell you about Heartland Agricultural Holdings." Unlike massive corporate investment groups that bought farmland simply to lease it back for profit, Heartland operated differently. They purchased struggling farms, modernized infrastructure only where necessary, protected historical equipment collections, and kept families on the land whenever possible. Their investors included retired farmers, agricultural engineers, local credit unions, even university research foundations. For nearly 12 years, Naomi had quietly helped build that company. Not as its employee, not as a consultant, as one of its largest founding partners. Nobody in Bibb County knew. She preferred it that way. Daniel handed her another folder. "The board wants your recommendation on the Lawson proposal." Naomi didn't open it. "Let's inspect the property first." "You still want to do it personally?" "I always do." Daniel smiled. "Your grandfather would have approved. So would yours." The two shared a quiet laugh before climbing into the SUV. Less than an hour later, Richard Lawson stood beside one of his irrigation pivots explaining expansion plans to two potential investors from Atlanta. "This whole section will become precision-irrigated soybeans next year." One investor pointed toward the neighboring Carter farm. "What about that property?" Richard chuckled. "Eventually it'll be mine." Just then, the black SUV rolled slowly into his driveway. Richard recognized Daniel immediately. "Heartland." He straightened his shirt. Perfect timing. Heartland had financed several large agricultural projects throughout Georgia. Landing them as investment partners would accelerate everything. Daniel stepped out first. Then Naomi. Richard's confident smile disappeared for only a fraction of a second before returning. "Didn't expect to see you here." Naomi simply nodded. "Morning." Richard looked toward Daniel. "You two know each other?" Daniel answered before Naomi could. "We've worked together for years." Richard assumed he meant consulting. Nothing more. He gestured proudly toward his machinery shed. Inside stood a lineup most farmers could only dream about. A John Deere S780 combine. A Case IH Magnum 340. High-capacity grain carts. GPS-guided planting equipment. Everything spotless. Everything expensive. Richard smiled. "Now this is modern farming." Naomi slowly walked past each machine. She admired them. Ran her hand lightly across the polished paint. "They're impressive." Richard grinned. "I knew you'd appreciate quality." She looked directly at him. Quality and price aren't always the same thing. The investors exchanged glances. Richard forced another laugh. "You still talking about that old Farmall?" Naomi nodded. "I am." One investor spoke up. "My grandfather had one." "They're reliable," Naomi said. "They're obsolete," Richard corrected. Naomi remained calm. They were designed to be repaired instead of replaced. Richard smirked. "That's called being outdated." Naomi shook her head gently. "Sometimes." She paused. "Sometimes it's called being built honestly." The conversation ended there. Not because Richard had won. Because nobody could think of a better reply. Have you ever stood in a place where everyone measured success by what was new, while you quietly valued what had already proven itself over decades? It's a lonely feeling, but sometimes it's also the beginning of wisdom. Before leaving, Daniel requested permission to inspect several drainage ditches crossing Richard's southern fields. Richard eagerly agreed. Anything Heartland needs. For the next 2 hours, Naomi walked every acre. She measured soil moisture, examined culverts, checked erosion along creek banks. She asked almost no questions, but she noticed everything. 1 damaged drainage tile, 2 neglected terraces, an aging bridge support beginning to crack beneath heavy equipment traffic. Daniel quietly made notes. Richard kept talking. He spoke about yields, expansion, profits, bigger machinery, more land. Naomi listened respectfully. Then she stopped beside an old pecan tree overlooking the property. This land drains toward Walnut Creek. Richard nodded. Always has. You've lost 6 inches of topsoil near the western edge. It's manageable. The bridge won't support another decade of heavier combines. We'll replace it. The creek bank is collapsing. Richard finally sighed. You came here to inspect my farm or criticize it? Naomi looked across the rolling fields shimmering beneath the Georgia afternoon sun. I came to understand it. Those words stayed with Daniel long after they climbed back into the SUV. As they drove away, Richard folded his arms. One of the Atlanta investors watched the vehicle disappear down the gravel road. Who exactly is she? Richard shrugged. Just a stubborn farmer. The investor wasn't convinced. No. He continued watching the dust settle behind the departing SUV. People don't inspect land like that unless they're making a decision much bigger than buying it. Richard laughed again. But this time, it sounded forced. That evening, Daniel received a call from Heartland's executive board. Their chairman asked only one question. Has Ms. Carter reached a decision? Daniel looked back toward the fading outline of Richard Lawson's farm beneath the setting Georgia sun. Yes, he answered quietly. And tomorrow morning. He glanced at the recommendation folder resting unopened on the passenger seat. Everything changes. The morning of September 20th, 2019, arrived with low gray clouds hanging over Bibb County, Georgia. By 7 o'clock, nearly every parking space outside the Macon Agricultural Credit Cooperative was occupied. Pickup trucks filled the lot. Seed dealers stood in small circles drinking coffee. Equipment salesmen exchanged quiet guesses. Nobody knew why Heartland Agricultural Holdings had requested a county-wide meeting on such short notice. Rumors spread quickly in farming communities. Some believed a new processing plant was coming. Others expected another corporate land purchase. Richard Lawson was convinced the meeting was about him. He adjusted the cuffs of his pressed shirt before stepping inside the conference hall. Several neighbors greeted him. Morning, Richard. You finally buying Carter's place? Richard smiled confidently. I expect we'll know something today. Across the room, Naomi Carter entered through a side door carrying a worn leather notebook instead of a briefcase. She wore the same clean denim shirt she wore in the fields. The same repaired boots. The same calm expression. A few people nodded politely. Most barely noticed her. Richard noticed. He couldn't resist. Walking toward a group of local farmers, he raised his voice just enough for Naomi to hear. Looks like somebody finally left the tractor long enough to attend a business meeting. Several people laughed. One equipment dealer smirked. Another shook his head with an amused grin. Richard wasn't trying to be cruel. He genuinely believed the room belonged to people with money. Naomi simply smiled. Every farm is a business, Richard. He chuckled. Not every farmer understands business. She answered quietly. Sometimes business is understanding the farm. The laughter faded. Richard walked away still smiling, convinced he had won the exchange. He had no idea the meeting had not even begun. At exactly 8 o'clock, the chairman of Heartland Agricultural Holdings stepped onto the small stage. His name was Harold Whitaker, a retired agricultural economist from Athens who had spent 40 years helping preserve family farms throughout the Southeast. He welcomed everyone. Then he spoke. Over the last 12 years, Heartland Agricultural Holdings has invested in preserving working farms instead of replacing them. Today, we are announcing our largest regional expansion in central Georgia. A projector illuminated a detailed county map. Dozens of farms appeared in green. Several were already protected through Heartland partnerships. Others had recently joined. Richard nodded with approval. This looked exactly like the opportunity he wanted. Harold continued. Our next phase will focus on helping family farms remain family farms while improving soil conservation, drainage systems, and equipment preservation. Then another slide appeared. One title: Regional Operations Director. Harold smiled warmly. I'd like to introduce the person who helped design this program from its very beginning. The audience looked toward the side entrance. Naomi stood. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Richard frowned. Surely she wasn't walking onto the stage. She was. Harold stepped aside. This program exists because one farmer believed preserving people mattered more than purchasing property. He extended his hand toward Naomi. Please welcome Ms. Naomi Carter. Silence. Complete silence. Richard's smile disappeared. The room erupted into surprised whispers. Naomi. The Carter girl. I thought she farmed 80 acres. Harold wasn't finished. Ms. Carter is not only one of our founding partners. She has personally overseen more than $214 million in agricultural preservation projects across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. The room froze. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The woman he had laughed at. The woman wearing patched boots. The woman driving a 70-year-old tractor. She had quietly spent more than a decade protecting farms exactly like his. Naomi stepped to the microphone. Her voice never rose. Good morning. She paused until every whisper stopped. My grandfather taught me something I never forgot. She glanced toward the audience. He said the measure of a farm isn't how much land one person owns. She smiled gently. It's how much better the land becomes after you've cared for it. No applause. Not yet. People were listening too carefully. Let me tell you about soil. Most people think wealth begins in a bank account. Farmers know differently. Healthy topsoil forms incredibly slowly. In many parts of Georgia, nature needs close to a century to build a single inch of productive soil. Wash that inch away through neglect, and generations lose something money cannot replace. Machinery can be purchased. Buildings can be rebuilt. Good soil must be earned over time. That's why the best farmers don't simply harvest crops. They protect tomorrow while feeding today. Naomi advanced the presentation. Maps filled the screen. Drainage improvements. Erosion control. Historic equipment restoration. Family succession planning. Every project centered on keeping farms operating instead of selling them. Then came the final map. Heartland's proposed expansion. Richard's farm sat directly in the middle. Harold returned to the microphone. Several landowners have requested partnership evaluations. Richard smiled again. This was finally his moment. Harold looked toward Naomi. Our regional director completed every inspection personally. Richard waited confidently. Naomi opened a folder. I have. She looked directly at Richard. Mr. Lawson. He stood proudly. We appreciate your interest. Thank you. She continued calmly. Your land has exceptional potential. Richard grinned. I knew it. But... The room became perfectly still. Our board unanimously recommends postponing any partnership until several long-term conservation issues are addressed. Richard's smile vanished. Naomi continued. Your western drainage channels require stabilization. The southern bridge needs structural reinforcement. The creek banks require restoration. Several terraces need rebuilding before expansion. Every recommendation appeared on the screen behind her. Photographs. Measurements. Engineering reports. No opinions. Only facts. Richard opened his mouth. Closed it again. Everything she described was true. He had simply delayed fixing those problems while purchasing additional land. Naomi wasn't embarrassing him. She was protecting the future of his farm. The realization settled over the room one quiet second at a time. Have you ever discovered that the person you underestimated understood your situation better than you understood it yourself? Pride can hide problems for years. Humility often notices them in a single afternoon. The meeting ended shortly afterward. People gathered around Naomi. Not because she was wealthy. Because they finally understood why she never hurried. Why she never argued. Why she listened more than she spoke. Across the parking lot, Richard remained beside his truck staring toward the distant fields beyond the highway. He heard footsteps behind him. Naomi. She stopped several feet away. Neither spoke immediately. Finally Richard broke the silence. I laughed at you. You did. In front of everyone. You did. I was wrong. Naomi looked toward the horizon where storm clouds were beginning to gather above the soybean fields. Being wrong isn't the hardest part. Richard looked at her. It's deciding what you do after you know you're wrong. Before he could answer, Daniel hurried across the parking lot carrying a ringing phone. His expression had completely changed. He handed the phone to Naomi without saying a word. She listened. Her calm face became suddenly serious. Very serious. She looked toward Richard's farm. Then toward the dark clouds rolling rapidly across Bibb County. When she finally spoke, she said only 6 words. We have to get there now. Richard didn't ask another question. He simply climbed into his pickup and followed Naomi's black SUV toward the western edge of Bibb County. The sky had turned the color of forged steel. Heavy rain had fallen through the night across counties north of Macon, and the National Weather Service had issued a flash flood warning for portions of central Georgia. Small creeks that normally wandered quietly through soybean fields were rising faster than anyone expected. By the time they reached Richard Lawson's southern property, Walnut Creek had already burst over its banks. Water rushed beneath the aging bridge Naomi had inspected only a day earlier. Then everyone heard it. A deep crack. Not thunder. Wood. The bridge supports shifted several inches. Richard stared in disbelief. My fertilizer truck. A fully loaded truck sat stranded on the opposite side. Beyond it were hundreds of acres with no safe exit. Daniel looked toward Naomi. What do we do? She answered immediately. Close the road. Richard hesitated. If we close it, I'll lose the harvest schedule. Naomi looked directly into his eyes. If you leave it open, someone could lose their life. For the first time since they had met, Richard didn't argue. He nodded. Close it. Within minutes, sheriff's deputies arrived. Neighbors gathered with tractors. Pickup trucks lined the road. Everyone worked together. The old rivalry disappeared beneath the urgency of the storm. Then another problem emerged. A large oak, weakened by days of rain, crashed across the only gravel lane leading to the stranded truck. Modern equipment couldn't reach it. The ground had become too soft. One of the younger operators shook his head. My tractor's too heavy. It'll sink. Another agreed. So will mine. Richard stood silently. Then he looked across the road. There sat Naomi's 1951 Farmall M on its trailer. He almost smiled. Not because it was old. Because he finally understood why she had never replaced it. Naomi climbed into the familiar steel seat. The Farmall started with its steady, unmistakable rhythm. She eased it onto the muddy lane, its lighter weight allowing it to cross ground that heavier tractors would have buried themselves in. Behind it rolled the old logging chain her grandfather had forged decades earlier. The chain wrapped around the fallen oak. Naomi eased the throttle forward. The Farmall didn't roar. It simply pulled. Slowly. Steadily. The oak shifted. Another foot. Then another. Mud flew beneath the rear tires. The old tractor never rushed. It never quit. A path opened wide enough for emergency crews to reach the trapped truck. Several farmers removed their hats. No one laughed. Not this time. Richard walked toward the Farmall after the work was finished. He rested one hand on the faded red hood. I called it a museum piece. Naomi climbed down. "It has earned the right to grow old." Richard nodded quietly. "So have you." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain finally began to ease. The clouds drifted east. Sunlight broke through just enough to reflect across the soaked soybean fields. Richard extended his hand. "I'm sorry." Naomi shook it. "I know. You forgave me pretty quickly." She smiled. "I forgave you yesterday." Richard looked surprised. "Why?" "Because carrying anger is heavier than carrying hay." Daniel laughed softly. "So that's where the wisdom comes from." Naomi looked toward the old farmhouse. "My father." Over the following months, Richard did something few people expected. He changed. Instead of buying more acreage, he invested in repairing the land he already owned. He rebuilt the western drainage system exactly as Naomi recommended. The damaged creek banks were stabilized with native grasses. The aging bridge was replaced before another storm could threaten it. He even began attending Heartland workshops, speaking openly about the mistakes he had made by chasing expansion while ignoring stewardship. Other farmers listened because they knew how difficult that admission had been. "Let me tell you about real wealth. It isn't measured by how many acres appear on a deed or how many machines fit inside a shed. Real wealth is leaving a farm healthier than you found it, teaching someone younger what took you decades to learn, and understanding that land is something we borrow from the next generation rather than own forever." 5 years later, in the autumn of 2024, Carter Farm looked much as it always had. The fences were straighter. The barns had fresh roofs. The soybean fields produced some of the highest conservation ratings in central Georgia. But the spirit of the place remained unchanged. Naomi still drove the Farmall M every spring. Children from local schools visited during agricultural education days. She let them climb onto the old steel seat. She showed them grease fittings, hand throttles, manual choke controls. She told them machines had stories if someone cared enough to listen. Richard often volunteered during those events. Whenever a child pointed at the faded tractor and asked why anyone still used something so old, he smiled before answering. "Because that tractor taught me something no new machine ever could." "What was that?" they would ask. "Respect." 10 years later, Heartland Agricultural Holdings had helped preserve more than 120,000 acres of working family farmland across the southeast. Naomi never moved into a mansion. She never appeared on magazine covers. She still lived in the same white farmhouse surrounded by pecan trees. She still walked the fields before sunrise. Still repaired equipment with her own hands. Still believed every healthy crop began with healthy soil. When she finally retired years later, leadership passed to a younger generation of farmers she had quietly mentored. The Farmall M remained in the equipment shed. Not behind ropes in a museum. Not polished for display. It was still fueled. Still maintained. Still started on the first cool morning of every planting season. Richard, now older himself, often stopped by for coffee. The conversations were never about money. They were about weather, grandchildren, soil, and the strange way life sometimes teaches its most important lessons through the people we almost overlooked. Some visitors asked Naomi whether she regretted never selling the farm. She always gave the same answer. "If I'd sold the land, I might have gained a fortune." She looked toward the fields stretching beneath another Georgia sunset. "But I would have lost my home." Some things aren't truly valuable because they're rare. They're valuable because someone quietly cared for them long enough that they could still serve others. If this story reminded you of someone who worked quietly, never sought attention, and let their actions speak louder than their words, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Have you ever known an old farmer, mechanic, rancher, or neighbor who proved everyone wrong simply by staying patient and doing the job well? Share their story below. I read every one. And if you'd like to hear about the Tennessee farmer who rescued a forgotten 1948 Oliver 88 from the bottom of a flooded creek and uncovered a family secret that had been buried for 40 years, I hope you'll join me for that story too.